They say the uniform means something different to everyone who sees it. To some, it's respect. To others, it's sacrifice. But when I walked into that courtroom in my navy dress blues, my brother Travis leaned back in his chair and laughed out loud. My mother looked at me like I'd shown up to a funeral in a clown costume, shaking her head with that familiar expression of disappointment I'd seen my whole life. She whispered something to her attorney, probably about how dramatic I was being, how I always had to make everything about me. But then Judge Harold Martinez looked up from his bench, and everything changed. His eyes went straight to the trident on my chest, the seal insignia I'd earned through blood and 27 months of the hardest training most people can't even imagine. He sat up straighter. His entire demeanor shifted. And in that moment, I knew walking in wearing this uniform wasn't about drama or spite. It was about reminding everyone in that room exactly who I was and what I'd sacrificed while they were back home rewriting history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Kelsey Brennan. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last 12 years of my life serving as a Navy SEAL, one of the first women to make it through the program when they finally opened combat roles to us. I've deployed 4 times to places I still can't talk about in detail. I've carried wounded teammates off battlefields. I've made decisions in split seconds that meant life or death for people depending on me. I've proven myself over and over again in a world that didn't think women belonged there. And yet, somehow, I'm standing in a North Carolina courtroom fighting my own brother and mother for the one thing my father actually left me. The one thing he wanted me to have. The 80 acres of mountain land in Henderson County where he taught me how to shoot, how to track, how to survive. The ranch where I learned the discipline and physical endurance that got me through SEAL training. The place he specifically named me as sole heir to in his will, written 6 months before he died. But before we get to how I ended up in that courtroom, before I tell you about the judge's reaction that made my brother's smirk disappear and my mother's face go pale, I need you to understand how deep this betrayal goes. This isn't a story about an inheritance dispute. This is about a family that never wanted me to succeed, that resented every achievement, that tried to erase me from the narrative even while I was overseas risking my life. This is about discovering that the people who should have had your back were actually holding the knife. Growing up in Asheville, North Carolina, I was always the strange one in the Brennan family. My brother Travis was 3 years older, and from the moment he could walk, he was exactly what our mother Patricia wanted. Charming, social, interested in the right things. He played baseball in high school, dated the popular girls, went to the homecoming dances, and generally lived the life of a kid who understood how to play the game. I was the one who'd rather spend Saturday mornings in the woods with my father. While Travis slept in until noon, I'd be up at dawn, following Dad through the trails on our property, learning how to read tracks, how to move quietly, how to field dress a deer. My father, Robert Brennan, was a retired Navy man himself, not a SEAL but a corpsman who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam. He never talked much about his time in service, but I saw the way he carried himself. The discipline. The quiet competence. The way he could fix anything with his hands and solve any problem if you gave him enough time to think it through. Our property was his pride. 80 acres of mountain land with a main house, a stable for the 3 horses we kept, a guest cabin my grandfather had built in the 1950s, and Dad's workshop where he did woodworking. He'd inherited the land from his father, who'd bought it in 1948 when property was cheap and men coming back from World War II were building lives in the mountains. The workshop was where Dad spent most of his free time, building furniture that he'd sell at craft fairs or give away to neighbors. He taught me how to use every tool in that shop, how to measure twice and cut once, how to sand a piece of wood until it was smooth as glass. Travis never had any interest in any of it. He'd come out to the workshop occasionally when Mom made him, stand around for 10 minutes looking bored, then find an excuse to leave. He didn't like getting dirty. Didn't like the smell of sawdust or the calluses that came from working with your hands. He tolerated the horses because girls thought they were romantic, but he never mucked a stall or fixed a fence or did any of the actual work that came with keeping animals. Mom never hid her preference. She'd grown up in Charlotte, the daughter of a banker, and she'd married Dad thinking his Navy career would lead somewhere impressive. When he retired as a senior chief instead of becoming an officer, when he chose to buy land in the mountains instead of a house in a suburb with a country club, I think she felt cheated. She never said it directly, but you could feel it in the way she talked about other people's lives, other people's houses, other people's successful children. Travis was her project. She pushed him toward business school, toward real estate, toward anything that looked successful on paper. She threw a massive graduation party when he finished his bachelor's degree at UNC Asheville, inviting everyone she knew to celebrate her son, the college graduate. When I graduated high school a year early with a 4.0 and a full ride to NC State for engineering, she took me to dinner at Applebee's. Just the two of us. Dad had to work. Travis had a date. We ate in near silence, and she spent most of the meal on her phone. I went to NC State and hated it. Not the academics, I was good at those. But I felt trapped. Restless. I'd go running every morning, pushing myself harder and harder, and it still wasn't enough. I'd spend weekends rock climbing, hiking, doing anything physical that made me feel alive. My roommate thought I was crazy. My engineering professors thought I was wasting my potential. But I knew something was missing. Halfway through my sophomore year, I saw a documentary about Navy SEALs. It wasn't the glorified Hollywood version. It was real footage of training, of missions, of the kind of work that required everything you had and then some. I watched these people push past every limit, work as a team with absolute trust, and do things that actually mattered. And I thought, that's what I've been looking for. Women weren't allowed in SEAL training yet. This was 2009, and combat roles were still officially closed to us. But I knew the policy would change eventually. It had to. So I joined the Navy, went through basic, got myself into the best physical shape of my life, and waited. I became a hospital corpsman like my father, deployed twice to Afghanistan in that role, and kept training. Every spare moment, I was running, swimming, doing pull-ups, preparing for the chance that might never come. When they finally opened SEAL training to women in 2016, I was one of the first to volunteer. I was 26 years old, and I'd been waiting 7 years for this moment. My father was so proud he cried when I told him. Actually cried, standing in his workshop with sawdust on his hands, hugging me so tight I could barely breathe. He said he always knew I had it in me, that he saw it when I was just a kid hiking those trails without complaint, keeping up with him even when my legs were half the length of his. My mother's reaction was different. She sighed. Literally sighed, like I'd just told her I was dropping out of school to join a cult. She said, "Kelsey, honey, don't you think you've proven whatever point you're trying to make? You're almost 30. Shouldn't you be thinking about settling down?" Travis, who was sitting in the living room when I made the announcement, laughed and said, "Good luck with that. I give her 2 weeks before she quits." I didn't quit. I made it through basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, all 3 phases, the only woman in my class to complete it. Hell Week almost broke me. 5.5 days of continuous training with a maximum of 4 hours of sleep total. Cold water that made your bones ache. Instructors screaming in your face. Boats on your head. Carrying logs with your swim buddy until your shoulders felt like they were separating from your body. At one point, around day 3, I was so cold and exhausted I couldn't remember my own name. But I didn't ring the bell. I didn't quit. My father flew out to California for my graduation. He sat in the audience in his old Navy uniform, the one he'd kept all these years, and when they pinned the Trident on my chest, I looked for him in the crowd. He was standing, tears streaming down his face, saluting me. My mother didn't come. She said the flight was too expensive and she had a charity luncheon she'd already committed to. Travis didn't come either. He was busy with some real estate deal that was definitely going to make him rich this time. Over the next 6 years, I deployed 4 times. I can't talk about most of what I did. Some of it's classified. Some of it I just don't want to relive. But I did my job. I proved every single person wrong who said women couldn't handle combat, couldn't carry the gear, couldn't make the split-second decisions that combat requires. I earned the respect of every man I served with, not because they handed it to me, but because I bled for it. And through all of it, my father was my anchor. He wrote me letters. Actual handwritten letters on paper, the kind nobody writes anymore. He'd tell me about the horses, about the furniture he was building, about the weather in the mountains. He'd tell me he was proud of me. That he knew what I was doing mattered even if he didn't know the details. That he loved me. I kept every single letter in a waterproof bag, and on the hardest nights, the ones where I'd seen things I couldn't unsee, I'd read them and remember there was still good in the world. My mother never wrote. Not once in 6 years. Travis sent a Facebook message after my second deployment asking if I could lend him $20,000 for a business venture. I was literally in Afghanistan when I got it. I didn't respond. 3 years ago, in the spring of 2021, I was training new recruits in Virginia Beach when I got the call. Dad had a massive heart attack while working in his shop. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was 68 years old, and he died with a piece of cherry wood in his hands, building what would have been a jewelry box for my mother's birthday. I flew home for the funeral. The place was packed. Dad had been well loved in the community, the kind of man who'd fix your fence for free or help you move furniture or show up with tools when you needed something built. People told stories about his kindness, his skill, his quiet way of making everyone around him better. My mother stood at the front accepting condolences like a politician at a campaign stop, gracious and composed. Travis stood next to her, playing the devoted son, talking about how much he'd learned from Dad, how close they were. I stood in the back in my dress uniform, and I wanted to scream. Because I was the one who knew Dad. I was the one who spent time with him, who learned from him, who carried his values into the world. But somehow, in death, they were already rewriting the story. Already making him into something that fit their narrative instead of honoring who he actually was. The will reading happened a week after the funeral. Dad's attorney, an older man named Gerald Hoffman who'd known our family for 30 years, gathered us in his office downtown. It was a small room with wood paneling and pictures of old Asheville on the walls. Mom sat in the center chair, Travis beside her. I sat across from them, still in uniform because I had to fly back to Virginia Beach that evening. Mr. Hoffman read through the standard provisions first. Mom got the house in town, the one they'd bought 20 years ago when Dad retired. She got his pension, his life insurance, his savings accounts. Travis got Dad's truck and some of his tools. Normal stuff, exactly what you'd expect. Then Mr. Hoffman paused, looked directly at me, and said, and to my daughter Kelsey Brennan, who carries my spirit and my values into everything she does, I leave the entire 80 acres of the family ranch in Henderson County, including the main house, the stable, the workshop, and all structures therein. She is to be the sole owner with full rights to sell, develop, or maintain the property as she sees fit. The silence in that office was deafening. My mother's face went from calm to furious in about 2 seconds. Travis actually stood up, knocking his chair back. He said, "That's not right. That can't be right. The ranch belongs to the family. Dad wouldn't give it all to her." Mr. Hoffman, to his credit, didn't flinch. He said, "I assure you this will was written 6 months ago, properly witnessed and notarized, while Robert was of sound mind. This is exactly what he wanted." Mom's voice was ice cold when she spoke. "Kelsey doesn't even live here. She's never here. What's she going to do with 80 acres? This is clearly a mistake." I sat there, too stunned to speak. The ranch. Dad had left me the ranch. The place that meant everything to both of us. The land his father had bought, that he'd cared for his entire life. He'd chosen me to be its guardian. Travis was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. "This is insane. I'm the oldest. I'm the son. I live here. I could actually use that property for something. She's going to sell it and disappear again." Mr. Hoffman closed the folder containing the will. The document is legal and binding. Kelsey is the sole heir to the ranch property. If you wish to contest the will, that's your right, but I should tell you that Robert was very clear about his wishes when we drafted this. He said Kelsey was the only one who understood what the land meant, and he wanted it protected. My mother stood up, smoothing her skirt with shaking hands. We'll see about that. Come on, Travis. They walked out without another word to me. Didn't ask how I felt. Didn't acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, Dad had a good reason for making this choice. They left me sitting in that office, holding a folder with property deeds and a letter Mr. Hoffman handed me after they were gone. I waited until I was alone to read Dad's letter. It was dated 6 months before he died, written in his careful handwriting on lined notebook paper. Kelsey, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I won't be there to see what you do next, but I know it will be something that makes me proud. You always have. The ranch is yours now. Not because Travis doesn't deserve it, but because he doesn't understand it. He sees property value and development potential. You see what I saw. A place to breathe. A place to remember what matters. A place to teach the next generation how to be strong and self-reliant and connected to something bigger than themselves. Your mother never understood why I chose the mountains over her Charlotte suburbs. Travis never understood why I spent weekends building furniture instead of building a business empire. But you understood. You always understood. Take care of the land the way my father taught me to take care of it. And remember that being strong doesn't mean being hard. It means knowing what you value and protecting it, even when people don't understand. I love you, sweetheart. I'm so proud of the woman you became. Dad. I sat in my rental car in the parking lot and cried for 20 minutes. Then I flew back to Virginia Beach and tried to process what had just happened. The ranch was mine. The place I loved most in the world was mine. But I was stationed across the country, deployed half the time, and my family was already furious about it. Over the next 6 months, I tried to handle things long distance. I hired a property management company to check on the place, keep the utilities running, handle basic maintenance. I paid all the expenses out of my own pocket. I started making plans for eventually retiring there, maybe in another 10 years when I'd done my 20 and could transition out of active duty. Travis called me twice during those 6 months. Both times, he wanted to buy the property. He'd found investors, he said. They could develop it into luxury cabins, high-end rentals for tourists coming to Asheville. He'd give me a fair price. $800,000. $900,000. Finally, he offered $1 million even, which he said was more than the land was worth undeveloped. I said no every time. The land wasn't for sale. Dad had left it to me to protect it, not to turn it into someone's vacation rental investment scheme. Travis would argue, try to convince me I was being stubborn and impractical, that I was wasting an asset I couldn't even use. I'd hang up exhausted, wondering why he couldn't just accept Dad's decision and move on. Then, about 18 months ago, things escalated. I got a certified letter from an attorney in Asheville. Travis and my mother were contesting the will. They claimed Dad had been unduly influenced, that he wasn't of sound mind when he wrote it, that the distribution was unfair and didn't represent his true wishes. They were suing to have the will overturned and the property divided equally among all 3 of us. I couldn't believe it. My own mother and brother were taking me to court, trying to legally steal the one thing Dad had wanted me to have. The one clear choice he'd made about his legacy. I called Mr. Hoffman immediately, and he explained that will contests weren't uncommon but this one would be hard to prove. Dad had been healthy when he wrote the will, had clearly articulated his reasoning, had been witnessed by 2 independent people who confirmed he was lucid and intentional. But it didn't matter to Travis and Mom. They pushed forward with the lawsuit. And because I was deployed, because I was literally overseas serving my country, I couldn't fight back effectively. I gave depositions over video calls from military bases I couldn't name. I submitted evidence through my attorney while dealing with mission schedules that didn't care about my personal legal problems. I watched from thousands of miles away as my family tried to dismantle my father's final gift to me. The hearing was finally scheduled for January of this year, 3 years after Dad's death. 18 months of legal wrangling, depositions, financial disclosures, character witnesses, all building toward a single court date where a judge would decide whether my father's clearly stated wishes would be honored or ignored. I requested leave specifically to be there in person, because I knew this was too important to handle remotely. I needed to look Travis and my mother in the eye and make them face what they were trying to do. The night before the hearing, I made a decision. I was going to wear my uniform. Not civilian clothes, not a business suit like my attorney suggested. My Navy dress blues, the uniform I'd earned through 12 years of service and 4 combat deployments. The uniform with the trident that represented every sacrifice I'd made, every limit I'd pushed past, every moment I'd chosen duty over comfort. My friend Vanessa, who I'd served with before she medically retired and opened a gym in Asheville, tried to talk me out of it. We met for coffee the night before at a place downtown, and she said, "Kels, are you sure about this? It might look like you're trying to play the military card, like you're guilting them." I stirred my coffee, thinking about how to explain it. "Van, they've spent 3 years trying to paint me as the absent daughter who doesn't care about family. They've told everyone I abandoned Dad, that I was never around, that I don't deserve the ranch because I don't even live here. The uniform is the truth. It's why I wasn't around. It's what I was doing instead of hanging out in Asheville building failed business ventures. I'm not trying to guilt anyone. I'm reminding them who I am." Vanessa nodded slowly. "You're reminding them that while they were here living comfortable lives, you were overseas getting shot at." "Exactly." So the next morning, I put on my dress blues. I polished every button until it gleamed. I made sure my ribbons were perfectly aligned, my trident positioned exactly right, my cover sitting at the precise angle required by regulation. I looked at myself in the mirror of my hotel room and saw a Navy SEAL, a warrior, a woman who'd earned every single thing she wore. And I walked into that courthouse ready for whatever came next. The Buncombe County Courthouse sits in downtown Asheville, a historic building with columns and wide stone steps that look impressive but do nothing to calm the nerves of people walking through its doors. I arrived 30 minutes early, wanting to get a feel for the courtroom before everyone else showed up. My attorney, Monica Garza, met me in the lobby. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd been recommended by Mr. Hoffman, someone who specialized in estate disputes and had a reputation for being relentless in court. When she saw me in uniform, her eyebrows went up slightly, but she didn't comment. She just nodded once, a gesture that felt like approval, and said, "Courtroom 3. Second floor. Let's go over everything one more time before they arrive." We sat on a bench in the hallway outside the courtroom, and Monica walked me through what to expect. Travis's attorney would argue that Dad had shown signs of mental decline in his final months, that the unequal distribution of assets suggested he'd been confused or manipulated. They'd bring up the fact that I was rarely home, that I had no practical use for the property, that dividing it would be more fair to everyone involved. They might even suggest that I'd somehow influenced Dad during one of my brief visits home, though Monica said that argument was weak given how rarely I was actually in North Carolina. Our strategy was simpler. We had the will, properly executed and witnessed. We had Dad's letter to me, which clearly articulated his reasoning. We had testimony from Mr. Hoffman about Dad's mental state when drafting the will. And we had the fact that property distribution doesn't have to be equal to be valid. Parents are allowed to leave their assets however they choose, as long as they're mentally competent when making those decisions. I listened to Monica explain all of this in her calm, professional voice, but my mind kept drifting to the last conversation I'd had with Dad before he died. It was over the phone, and I'd been in Virginia Beach getting ready for a training exercise. He'd called just to check in, the way he did every few weeks. We talked about normal things. The weather. The new Colt one of the Maras had foaled. A dining table he was building for a customer in Hendersonville. Then, toward the end of the call, he said something that stuck with me. "You know, Kels, I've been thinking about what happens to the ranch when I'm gone. I want you to know it's taken care of. You don't need to worry about it." I'd brushed it off at the time, told him he had years ahead of him, that we didn't need to talk about that stuff yet. But he'd insisted. Just listen for a minute. That land means something. It's not just property. It's a connection to something bigger than us. Your grandfather understood that. I understand it. And you understand it. That's why it needs to stay with someone who'll protect it, not someone who sees dollar signs. I hadn't realized he was talking about the will. Hadn't known he'd already made arrangements. But sitting in that courthouse hallway, remembering his words, I felt certain about what I was doing. This wasn't about money or fairness or sibling rivalry. This was about honoring what Dad had valued and what he'd trusted me to preserve. At 9:45, I heard voices echoing in the stairwell. My mother's laugh, the fake one she used in public. Travis's deeper voice responding to something. Their attorney, a man named Richard Stokes who had a reputation for being aggressive in court, saying something about strategy. They rounded the corner and stopped when they saw me sitting there in uniform. Travis saw me first. He was wearing a suit that looked expensive but didn't quite fit right, and his hair was gelled in a way that made him look like he was trying too hard. When his eyes landed on me, on the uniform, on the trident gleaming on my chest, he actually laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A genuine amused laugh, like I'd just told a joke. He leaned toward Richard Stokes and said loud enough for me to hear, "Unbelievable. She actually wore the costume." My mother's reaction was different but equally dismissive. She looked at me, and her face did this thing it always did when she was disappointed. A slight shake of the head, lips pressed together, eyes that said I'd embarrassed her once again. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. That look communicated everything. "Kelsey, why do you always have to make everything so dramatic? Why can't you just be normal?" Monica stood up beside me, and I felt her presence like a shield. She said, "Good morning, Patricia. Travis. Richard. Shall we go inside?" The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches that reminded me of church pews and fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly washed out. The judge's bench sat elevated at the front, imposing despite the dated decor. We took our seats at the plaintiff's table, Travis and Mom and their attorney at the defense table across the aisle. The handful of spectators included Mr. Hoffman, Vanessa who'd insisted on being there for moral support, and a few people I didn't recognize. Probably friends of my mother's, here to witness what they thought would be my humiliation. At exactly 10 o'clock, the bailiff announced Judge Harold Martinez, and everyone stood. The judge entered through a side door, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd lived a full life before becoming a judge. He wore his black robes with the same kind of authority I'd seen in senior officers, that quiet confidence that comes from years of making hard decisions. He sat down, arranged some papers on his bench, and then looked up at the courtroom. His eyes swept across the room in a general survey, and then they landed on me. On my uniform. On the trident. I watched his entire posture change. He sat up straighter. His expression shifted from neutral judicial reserve to something I recognized immediately. Respect. Understanding. The look one service member gives another. Judge Martinez spent a long moment just looking at me, and then his eyes flicked to Travis, who was still smirking slightly, and to my mother, who had arranged her face into an expression of dignified suffering. When the judge spoke, his voice was measured but carried an edge I don't think anyone else in the room caught yet. "Before we begin," Judge Martinez said, "I want to acknowledge Petty Officer Brennan's service. Thank you for your sacrifice." He nodded directly at me, and I nodded back, the way you do when a fellow veteran recognizes you. It's a small gesture, barely noticeable to civilians, but it establishes something. A connection. A shared understanding. Travis shifted in his seat, and the smirk faltered just slightly. My mother's lawyer, Richard Stokes, stood up and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if we're ready to proceed, I'd like to begin by outlining the basis for this contest. The petitioners, Patricia and Travis Brennan, believe that the will executed by Robert Brennan does not reflect his true intentions and was created under circumstances that call its validity into question." Judge Martinez gestured for him to continue, but I noticed he was still watching me, still taking in the uniform and everything it represented. Richard Stokes launched into his opening argument. He painted a picture of a confused elderly man, a father who'd always treated his children equally, who'd never shown favoritism, who surely would have wanted his property divided fairly among his survivors. He talked about my absence, how I'd been gone for 12 years, how I barely visited, how I had no connection to the community or practical use for the land. He suggested, delicately, that perhaps I'd said something during one of my rare visits that had influenced Dad's thinking. It was all carefully worded, nothing directly accusatory, but the implication was clear. I was the outsider. The absent daughter. The one who didn't deserve what she'd been given. When Monica stood up to respond, her voice was crisp and factual. She presented the will, executed properly with 2 witnesses present. She presented Mr. Hoffman's testimony about Dad's mental state, sharp and clear and utterly competent 6 months before his death. She presented the letter Dad had written to me, the one explaining his reasoning in his own words. And then she said something that shifted the energy in the room. Your Honor, this isn't a case about fairness or equal distribution. This is a case about a father who knew his children well enough to understand which one would honor his legacy. Robert Brennan was a Navy veteran himself. He understood service. He understood sacrifice. He understood that his daughter wasn't absent because she didn't care. She was absent because she was serving her country in one of the most demanding roles the military offers. The fact that she's here today in uniform isn't dramatic or manipulative. It's honest. It's the truth about where she's been and what she's been doing while her brother was here in Asheville. Travis made a sound, something between a scoff and a laugh. Judge Martinez's eyes cut to him immediately, sharp and cold. Mr. Brennan, is there something you'd like to share with the court? Travis straightened up, suddenly realizing he'd drawn attention. No, Your Honor. Sorry. The judge held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary, then turned back to Monica. Continue, Counselor. Monica called Mr. Hoffman to the stand first. He testified about the day Dad came to his office to update his will, how specific he'd been about his wishes, how he'd anticipated that there might be conflict and had made sure everything was documented properly. Mr. Hoffman described Dad as completely lucid, thoughtful, and determined to ensure the ranch went to the person who would care for it the way he had. Richard Stokes cross-examined, trying to find any hint of confusion or coercion, but Mr. Hoffman held firm. Robert was one of the most clear-headed clients I've ever worked with, he said. He knew exactly what he was doing and why. Then Monica called me to the stand. I walked up with my cover under my arm, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Monica started with basic questions. My age, my years of service, my deployments. She asked me to describe my relationship with my father, and I told the truth. That he was my mentor, my role model, the person who taught me everything that mattered. That we wrote letters constantly when I was deployed. That he came to my BUD/S graduation when no one else in my family bothered to show up. Then Monica asked, why do you think your father left the ranch specifically to you? I looked at Travis and my mother, then back at Monica. Because he knew I understood what it meant. Not as an investment or a development opportunity, but as a place that connects you to something bigger than yourself. My grandfather bought that land after World War II. My father maintained it his whole life. He taught me how to care for it, how to respect it. He knew I'd protect it the way he did. Richard Stokes stood up for cross-examination, and his strategy became immediately clear. He wanted to paint me as disconnected from the family, as someone who'd chosen military service over family obligations, as someone who hadn't earned the right to inherit the property because I wasn't around to maintain a relationship with Dad in his final years. Petty Officer Brennan, he began, and I noticed he used my rank with a slight edge, like it was a costume I was wearing rather than something I'd earned. How many times did you visit your father in the 3 years before his death? I'd prepared for this question. 4 times. Once for 10 days when I had leave between deployments. Twice for long weekends when I had brief breaks in training schedules. And once for his birthday, when I flew in for 48 hours before having to return to base. 4 times in 3 years. That's not very many visits, is it? It's what my deployment and training schedule allowed. I served overseas for 18 of those 36 months. But your brother Travis was here consistently. He saw your father regularly. He helped maintain the property. He was present in your father's daily life. Doesn't that suggest he might have had a closer relationship? Monica started to object, but I answered before she could. Travis lived 15 minutes away and visited maybe once a month when he needed something. I was in Afghanistan and wrote Dad letters every week. Presence isn't measured in miles, counselor. It's measured in connection. Richard Stokes didn't like that answer. He tried a different angle. You're currently stationed in Virginia Beach, correct? Correct. And you plan to remain in the Navy for the foreseeable future? I have 8 more years until retirement eligibility. So you have no immediate plans to live on this property, to maintain it yourself, to be an active part of the community your father was part of? I have a property management company handling maintenance. I pay all expenses. When I retire, I intend to live there full time. But even before then, the property is being cared for properly. At what cost? How much are you paying annually for this property management? Monica objected. Relevance, Your Honor. Judge Martinez sustained it, but Richard Stokes had made his point. Or thought he had. He was trying to show I was an absentee owner, that the property was a burden to me, that it made more sense to sell it or divide it among family members who were actually local. He asked a few more questions about my deployments, trying to establish that I'd been out of touch with family dynamics, that I didn't really know what Dad wanted because I was never there to observe him in his final years. I answered each question calmly, truthfully, and I watched Judge Martinez taking notes, his expression unreadable but his attention focused entirely on my testimony. Finally, Richard Stokes wrapped up. No further questions, Your Honor. I stepped down from the stand and returned to my seat next to Monica. She leaned over and whispered, "You did great. Now we wait." But we didn't have to wait long. Judge Martinez called a 15-minute recess, and when we returned, he had clearly made his decision. He didn't drag things out or announce he'd need time to review the evidence. He sat down, looked directly at my mother and brother, and began speaking in a tone that left no room for argument. I've reviewed the will in question, the testimony provided, and the letter written by Robert Brennan to his daughter. I've also observed the behavior of everyone in this courtroom, and I'm ready to issue my ruling. He paused, and the silence was absolute. The will is valid. Robert Brennan was of sound mind when he executed this document. His reasoning was clearly articulated both in the will itself and in his personal letter to Petty Officer Brennan. The unequal distribution of assets is not evidence of confusion or undue influence. It's evidence of a father who knew his children well enough to understand who would honor his wishes. Travis started to stand up, but his attorney grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. Judge Martinez continued, his voice hardening. What I find troubling about this case is the suggestion that military service should somehow disqualify someone from inheriting property. Petty Officer Brennan wasn't absent because she didn't care about her father. She was absent because she was serving her country, something her father, as a Navy veteran himself, understood and respected. The fact that she's here in uniform today tells me everything I need to know about her character and priorities. My mother's face had gone completely still, that frozen expression she got when something wasn't going her way but she had to maintain appearances. Travis looked like he'd been slapped. Richard Stokes was scribbling notes furiously, probably already thinking about appeals. Judge Martinez wasn't finished. Furthermore, I want to address the notion that presence equals relationship. I've seen the letters submitted as evidence, written between Robert and Kelsey Brennan over 12 years of service. I've read excerpts of those letters in chambers, and they demonstrate a depth of connection that geography cannot diminish. Some parents see their children every day and don't know them at all. Robert Brennan knew his daughter. He knew what mattered to her, what she valued, and why she'd chosen the path she did. That's why he left her the ranch. The judge looked directly at me then, and something passed between us. Recognition. Understanding. The acknowledgement that some people got it and some people never would. The petition to contest the will is denied. The property remains solely in Kelsey Brennan's name, as Robert Brennan intended. Court costs will be paid by the petitioners. He brought his gavel down once, sharp and final. We're adjourned. The sound of that gavel hitting the bench felt like vindication. Like justice. Like my father's voice speaking through the legal system, finally being heard by someone who understood. I stood up, and Monica shook my hand, her professional composure cracking just enough to show a genuine smile. Congratulations, Kelsey. The ranch is yours. Legally, finally, completely yours. Across the aisle, Travis was arguing with his attorney in a harsh whisper. My mother was gathering her purse with precise, angry movements, her face a mask of controlled fury. They didn't look at me as they left the courtroom. Didn't acknowledge the ruling or the judge's words. They just walked out, and I watched them go with a strange mix of sadness and relief. Vanessa came up and hugged me hard, lifting me slightly off the ground despite the fact that I was in dress uniform. You did it, Kels. Your dad would be so proud. Mr. Hoffman approached more formally, shaking my hand with both of his. Robert would have loved seeing you in that courtroom today. He always said you had more backbone than anyone he'd ever met. Today proved him right. We walked out of the courthouse together into January sunshine that felt warmer than it should have. I stood on those stone steps, looking out at downtown Asheville, and felt something shift inside me. For 3 years, I'd been carrying the weight of this fight, the uncertainty of whether my father's wishes would be honored, whether the one clear thing he'd wanted from me would be taken away by people who'd never understood either of us. Now it was over. The ranch was mine, legally and irrevocably. And more than that, I'd been seen. Not dismissed as the absent daughter or the dramatic one showing up in uniform for effect. I'd been recognized for exactly what I was. A warrior. A daughter. Someone who'd earned every single thing she had and wasn't about to let it be stolen by people who valued money over meaning. Monica and I went to lunch at a small restaurant downtown, and she walked me through the next steps. The ruling was final unless they appealed, and she doubted they would. Travis's attorney had known this was a weak case from the beginning, had probably told them as much, but they'd pushed forward anyway out of stubbornness or entitlement or whatever motivated people to fight losing battles. Now it was done, and I could finally move forward with plans for the property. But sitting there across from Monica, eating a sandwich I barely tasted, I realized something had changed beyond just winning the legal case. Something had broken between me and my family. Not just cracked or damaged, but completely severed. They'd looked at me in that courtroom with contempt and dismissal, had tried to paint my service as abandonment, had reduced 12 years of sacrifice to a convenient excuse for not being around. And Judge Martinez had seen through it all. He'd understood instantly what they never would, that military service isn't a choice you make because it's easy or convenient or because you want to avoid family obligations. It's a choice you make because something inside you needs to serve something bigger than yourself. My father had understood that. The judge understood it. My mother and Travis never would, and I was done trying to make them see it. After lunch, I drove out to the ranch for the first time since the hearing. The property management company had kept everything maintained, but I needed to see it with my own eyes. Needed to walk the land that was now definitively, legally, permanently mine. I turned off the main highway onto Laurel Creek Road, wound through the mountains for 3 miles, and pulled up to the gate with the Brennan name still carved into the wooden sign my grandfather had made 70 years ago. The main house sat on a rise overlooking the valley, a 2-story log structure my grandfather had built with his own hands after coming home from the war. The stable was off to the right, empty now since I'd sold the horses when Dad died, unable to care for them from Virginia Beach. The workshop sat behind the house, its windows dark but the structure solid, waiting. I got out of my car, still in my uniform, and walked up to the workshop door. Inside, everything was exactly as Dad had left it. Tools hung on pegboards in precise arrangements. Half-finished projects sat on workbenches, waiting for hands that would never return to complete them. The smell of sawdust and wood oil and something indefinably him still lingered in the air. I stood in the center of the workshop, surrounded by evidence of my father's care and skill and dedication to craft, and let myself cry for the first time since the funeral. These weren't tears of sadness, though that was part of it. They were tears of relief. Of gratitude. Of the overwhelming weight of responsibility finally settling onto shoulders that were strong enough to carry it. This place was mine now. Not because I'd fought for it, though I had. Not because a judge had ruled in my favor, though he did. But because my father had known, had trusted, had believed that I would protect what he'd built and what his father had built before him. I spent 3 hours at the ranch that afternoon. I walked every trail I remembered from childhood. I checked the fence lines and the water system and the roof that would need repair soon. I sat on the porch of the main house and watched the sun move across the valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and shadow. And I made plans. Real plans. For the first time in 3 years, I could actually think about what came next without the legal battle hanging over everything. I had 8 more years until military retirement. 8 years to save money, to prepare, to figure out exactly what I wanted this place to become. Maybe a retreat for veterans, a place where people who'd served could come to heal and reconnect with something solid and real. Maybe a working ranch again, horses and land management and teaching kids the skills my father had taught me. Maybe just a home, the place I'd come back to after 20 years of service, the anchor I'd always needed. But whatever it became, it would be built on the foundation my father had left me. Not just the physical property, but the values he'd lived by and tried to pass on to children who'd received those lessons with varying degrees of acceptance. Travis had never wanted to learn. Mom had actively resented the choices Dad made. But I'd absorbed everything he offered, had carried those lessons into a life of service, and now I'd carry them forward into whatever came next. When I finally drove away from the ranch that evening, I looked back at the property in my rearview mirror and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Pure, uncomplicated peace. The fight was over, and I'd won. Not through manipulation or deception or playing games, but through the simple act of being exactly who my father had raised me to be. Honest. Dedicated. Strong enough to stand alone when everyone else walked away. My phone buzzed as I was driving back toward Asheville. A text from a number I didn't recognize. I waited until I was stopped at a light to check it. The message was from Travis. You got what you wanted. Hope you're happy. Don't expect us to forgive this. I read it twice, then deleted it without responding. Because there was nothing to say. I hadn't done anything that required forgiveness. I'd simply refused to let them steal what wasn't theirs. If they wanted to spend the rest of their lives resenting me for that, that was their choice. But I was done carrying the weight of their disappointment. Done trying to earn approval from people who'd never been capable of giving it. I spent that night at the hotel near the airport, my flight back to Virginia Beach scheduled for early the next morning. Vanessa came by with takeout Thai food, and we sat on the floor of my hotel room eating pad Thai out of containers and talking about everything that had happened. The look on Travis's face when the judge shut him down, Vanessa said, shaking her head. I wish I'd gotten a photo of that. I laughed, surprising myself. Did you see my mom? She looked like she'd bitten into something rotten but had to keep smiling for the cameras. That's her default expression, though. She always looks like that. Vanessa paused, serious now. How are you really doing with all this? They're still your family. I thought about that question. Were they still my family? Biologically, yes. Legally, yes. But family was supposed to mean something more than shared DNA and legal connections. Family was supposed to show up for you. Support you. Believe in you. See you for who you actually are instead of who they need you to be. They haven't been my family in a long time, I said finally. Maybe they never were. Dad was my family. You're my family. The guys in my unit who'd take a bullet for me without hesitation, they're my family. Travis and Mom are just people I'm related to. Vanessa nodded slowly. That's fair. And honestly, probably healthier than trying to maintain a relationship with people who clearly don't respect you. We talked until almost midnight, and then Vanessa left, making me promise to visit again soon, to bring her out to the ranch when I had time, to stay in touch better than I had been. I promised all of it, meaning every word. Because she was right. The people who actually showed up, who actually cared, those were the relationships worth maintaining. The next morning, I flew back to Virginia Beach and returned to my regular duties. But something had fundamentally changed. I'd gone to Asheville carrying 3 years of legal stress and family conflict and uncertainty about my father's legacy. I'd come back with clarity. With ownership, both legal and emotional. With the absolute certainty that I'd done the right thing by fighting for what Dad wanted, even when it meant standing alone against family members who thought they deserved what he'd chosen to give me. And I'd come back with a plan. 8 more years of service, then retirement to North Carolina. 8 years to save money and prepare the property and figure out exactly how to honor the trust my father had placed in me. 8 years to build the life he'd always known I was capable of building, even when everyone else doubted. But I wouldn't stay silent for 8 years. I wouldn't let Travis and Mom control the narrative about what had happened, the way they'd controlled every family story my whole life. Because the judge's words had given me something I'd never had before. Official validation. Legal recognition that my service mattered, that my relationship with Dad had been real and deep, that I hadn't been the problem child they'd always made me out to be. 3 days after returning to Virginia Beach, I did something I'd never done before. I wrote a detailed account of everything that had happened, the hearing, the uniform, the judge's ruling, all of it, and I posted it online. Not for revenge or to shame anyone, but because I knew there were other people out there fighting similar battles. Other service members whose families didn't understand or respect their choices. Other children dealing with will contests and inheritance fights and the pain of not being valued by the people who should have valued them most. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, hundreds of people were sharing their own stories, their own experiences with family rejection and legal battles and the struggle to maintain dignity when people you're related to treat you like you don't matter. Veterans reached out to thank me for speaking up. Attorneys contacted me to say they'd had similar cases and wished more judges understood what Judge Martinez clearly did. But the most meaningful message came from someone I didn't know, a woman named Catherine whose father had died 2 years earlier and whose siblings were trying to take the small piece of land he'd left her. She said my story gave her the courage to keep fighting, to trust that her father's wishes mattered, to believe that showing up in court as exactly who she was, a Marine Corps veteran in uniform, wasn't manipulation or playing games. It was truth. That message made everything worth it. The 3 years of legal stress. The family relationships that had shattered beyond repair. The hours spent documenting and preparing and fighting for something that should have been mine without question. Because if my experience could help even one person stand up for themselves, could give even one veteran the courage to demand respect from family members who dismissed their service, then it had meaning beyond just my own vindication. The weeks following the court ruling felt surreal in their normalcy. I returned to my duties at Virginia Beach, running training exercises with new recruits, maintaining my own physical standards, doing the daily work that defines military life. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I'd spent 12 years defining myself primarily through service, through the teams I worked with, through the missions we accomplished. The ranch had always been this distant dream, something I'd inherit eventually and deal with when the time came. Now it was real. Now it was mine, legally protected, waiting for me. And I found myself thinking about it constantly during downtime, sketching plans during slow moments, calculating finances to figure out what improvements I could afford while still active duty. The property management company sent me monthly reports, photos of the structures, updates on maintenance needs. Each report felt like a lifeline connecting me to something permanent in a life defined by temporary duty stations and deployments. About a month after the hearing, I got a call from Mr. Hoffman. He sounded different on the phone, more hesitant than usual, and I immediately tensed. Legal battles were supposed to be over. The ruling was final. What else could possibly need addressing? Kelsey, I'm calling because something's come up that you need to know about, he began. It's not a legal issue, exactly, but it involves the ranch and your family, and I thought you should hear it from me first. My stomach dropped. What happened? Travis has been telling people around town that you coerced your father into changing his will. He's been specific about it too, claiming you showed up on leave right before the will was drafted and convinced your father to cut him out. He's telling anyone who'll listen that the judge ruled in your favor because you wore your uniform to manipulate sympathy, not because the will was legitimate. I sat down on my bunk, processing this. Of course Travis was doing this. He couldn't accept losing in court, so now he was trying to win in the court of public opinion. Is he making these accusations publicly enough that I could do something about it legally? That's the gray area, Mr. Hoffman said. He's being careful to frame it as his opinion, his interpretation of events. It's not quite defamation because he's not stating false facts, he's offering a biased narrative. But it's damaging your reputation in the community, and I thought you should know. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time thinking about what Mr. Hoffman had told me. Part of me wanted to fly back to Asheville and confront Travis directly, force him to repeat his accusations to my face instead of spreading them behind my back. But another part of me recognized that responding would only feed the narrative. It would make me look defensive, like maybe there was some truth to what he was saying. Instead, I called Vanessa. She'd been keeping tabs on local gossip anyway, and when I asked her what she'd been hearing, she confirmed everything Mr. Hoffman had said and more. Travis was holding court at local bars, at his real estate office, anywhere people would listen. He was painting himself as the devoted son who'd been cheated by a sister who barely bothered to come home, a sister who'd manipulated their dying father during one of her rare visits. The thing is, Vanessa said, most people who actually knew your dad aren't buying it. They remember how he talked about you, how proud he was. But there are enough people who don't know the real story, and they're hearing Travis's version and believing it because it's the only version they're getting. So what do I do? You let the people who matter know the truth. You don't chase down every person Travis has lied to, but you make sure your story is out there too. The real story, with evidence. I thought about the letters Dad had written me over 12 years. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Each one carefully saved in waterproof bags through deployments, through transfers, through everything. Letters where he talked about the ranch, about his plans for it, about why it mattered to him that it stayed with someone who understood its value beyond dollars and development potential. Letters where he mentioned, multiple times over multiple years, that he wanted me to have it when he was gone. Those letters proved Travis was lying. They showed a pattern of intention that went back years before Dad had updated his will, years before any alleged coercion could have happened. And suddenly I knew exactly what I needed to do. I spent the next 3 days scanning every letter Dad had ever written me. I organized them chronologically, redacted any classified or sensitive information about deployments, and created a digital archive. Then I reached out to a journalist I'd met during a Navy PR event, a woman named Angela Chen who worked for a veteran-focused news website. I told her I had a story about military service, family conflict, and what happens when people try to rewrite history to suit their narrative. Angela flew down to Virginia Beach the following week with a photographer. We met at a coffee shop off base, and I laid out everything. The will contest, the hearing, Travis's current campaign to undermine the judge's ruling, and most importantly, the letters that proved my father's wishes went back years. I showed her excerpts from Dad's correspondence, passages where he talked about the ranch's future, where he explicitly stated his hope that I'd take it over someday. This is powerful, Angela said, reading through the letters I'd printed out. Your father was documenting his intentions for years. This completely contradicts your brother's narrative. That's the point. Travis is counting on people not knowing the full story, on them accepting his version because it's simpler or more dramatic. But the truth is documented. My father knew what he wanted, and he made sure I knew it too, long before he formalized it legally. The article Angela wrote was published 3 weeks later. It was titled, A Daughter's Service, How One Navy SEAL Fought to Honor Her Father's Legacy. She'd done her research beyond just my story, interviewing Mr. Hoffman, Vanessa, several of Dad's old friends who confirmed how he'd talked about me and the ranch over the years. She'd even gotten a comment from Judge Martinez's clerk about how the judge had been impressed by the depth of evidence supporting the will's validity. Most importantly, she'd included excerpts from Dad's letters. His own words, written over a decade, showing consistent intention about the ranch's future. One passage she quoted had been written 5 years before his death. When I was deployed to Afghanistan, Kelsey's out there doing what I never had the courage to do, serving in combat, putting herself in real danger. Travis is here complaining about the cost of everything and trying to convince me to sell off parcels of land to developers. I know which kid understands what this place means. When I'm gone, I hope Kelsey will take over the ranch and protect it the way it should be protected. The article went viral in veteran communities online. It was shared thousands of times, picked up by larger news outlets, discussed on military podcasts and veteran forums. Suddenly, my story wasn't just local gossip in Asheville. It was a national conversation about how military families handle inheritance, about respect for service, about what happens when sacrifice gets dismissed by people who've never made similar sacrifices themselves. Travis's narrative crumbled under the weight of documented evidence. People in Asheville who'd been listening to his version started asking questions. Why hadn't he mentioned these letters? Why had he claimed coercion when the written records showed years of consistent intention? The community began to see him for what he was, someone bitter about losing something he'd never deserved in the first place, someone willing to lie about his sister's character to avoid accepting his father's decision. My mother stayed silent through all of this. No public statements, no interviews, no responses to the article. But I heard through Vanessa that she'd stopped going to her regular social events, stopped posting on social media, essentially retreated from public life in Asheville. Whether from shame or strategy, I didn't know and didn't particularly care. She'd made her choice when she supported Travis's lawsuit. She'd made her position clear in that courtroom. Her silence now was just another form of the emotional absence I'd experienced my whole life. What surprised me was the outreach I started getting from other veterans dealing with similar situations. Email after email from service members whose families didn't respect their choices, who were fighting their own battles over inheritance or respect or simple acknowledgement. Many were women, dealing with the specific challenge of being dismissed by family members who didn't think women should serve in combat roles. Some were men whose families saw military service as a failure to achieve civilian success. One message particularly stood out. It was from a Marine named David Torres who'd served 3 tours in Iraq and come home to find his parents had promised his grandfather's woodworking shop to his younger brother who'd never left their hometown. His grandfather had specifically told David, multiple times, that the shop would be his someday. But there was no will, no legal documentation, and his parents had simply given it away to the brother who'd been physically present. David wrote, "Reading your story gave me the courage to speak up. I've been silent for 2 years, letting my brother have the shop because I didn't want to cause family drama. But you're right. Service matters. Sacrifice matters. The fact that I was in Fallujah instead of at Sunday dinners doesn't mean I cared less about my grandfather. It means I was doing something that mattered even more. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for winning. Thank you for showing the rest of us that we don't have to accept being erased." I responded to every message I could. Not with legal advice, because I wasn't qualified to give it, but with encouragement. With the reminder that documentation matters, that truth matters, that standing up for yourself isn't selfish or dramatic. It's necessary. I connected people with estate attorneys who understood military life. I shared resources about will contests and property rights. And I built a network, almost accidentally, of veterans who were fighting similar battles and needed to know they weren't alone. Summer came, and I requested 2 weeks of leave to spend time at the ranch. It was my first extended stay since Dad died, my first chance to really assess what needed to be done and start making concrete plans for the property's future. I flew into Asheville on a humid June morning, rented a truck, and drove straight out to Henderson County. The ranch looked different in summer. Everything was green and lush, the mountains visible in the distance through afternoon haze, wildflowers blooming along the fence lines. The property management company had done good work maintaining the basics, but I could see projects that needed attention. The stable roof had some missing shingles. The main house needed exterior paint. Dad's workshop had a window that was cracked and needed replacement. I spent the first 3 days just working. Physical labor, the kind I'd grown up doing with Dad, the kind that made my muscles ache and my hands dirty and my mind clear. I replaced fence posts that had rotted. I cleared brush from around the buildings. I patched the stable roof myself, balancing on a ladder in the heat, feeling competent and connected to the land in a way I never felt on a military base. Vanessa drove out on the fourth day with supplies and lunch. We sat on the porch of the main house eating sandwiches and drinking sweet tea, looking out at the valley. "You look different," she said after a while. "More settled." "I feel different. Like this is actually real now, not just a legal battle I was fighting. This is mine. I can shape it into whatever I want it to be." "Have you figured out what that is yet? What you want to do with it long term?" "I've been thinking about that question constantly. I want to open it up to other veterans. Not as a business, exactly, but as a resource. A place where people who've served can come to work with their hands, to be outside, to remember what it feels like to build something instead of destroy things. Dad taught me everything I know about woodworking, about land management, about how working with your hands can heal parts of you that therapy can't reach. I want to offer that to other people who need it." Vanessa nodded slowly. "A retreat?" "Sort of. But not the spa kind with meditation and massage. The kind where you show up and someone hands you tools and puts you to work fixing a fence or building a table or clearing a trail. The kind where the healing happens through doing, not talking. Your dad would love that." She was right. Dad had always believed in the value of skilled work, of creating something tangible with your own hands. He'd taught me that when words failed, when emotions were too complicated to process, you could work through it by focusing on a task that had clear steps and a visible result. Sand this board smooth. Measure this cut precisely. Stack this firewood in straight rows. Simple tasks that required attention and effort and gave you something concrete to show for your time. Over the next week, I mapped out what this vision would require. The stable could be converted into a workshop space for woodworking and leather crafting and other trades. The guest cabin could house visitors for weekend retreats or longer stays. The main house would need updates to make it comfortable year-round, better insulation, a more efficient heating system, maybe solar panels to reduce operating costs. The land itself offered opportunities for outdoor projects, trail building and maintenance, habitat restoration, sustainable forestry. It would take years to fully realize this vision. It would take money I didn't have yet, though I was saving aggressively. It would take building relationships with veteran organizations that could refer people who'd benefit from this kind of program. It would take figuring out insurance and liability and all the administrative details that came with opening your property to others. But for the first time since Dad died, I had a clear picture of the future. Not just a vague plan to eventually retire to the ranch, but a specific purpose that would honor his legacy while serving others. On my last day of leave before flying back to Virginia Beach, I drove into Asheville to handle some business at the bank. I needed to set up an account specifically for ranch expenses and improvements, separate from my personal finances, to keep everything organized. I was walking out of the bank when I literally ran into my mother. She was coming up the sidewalk with shopping bags, dressed in one of her carefully coordinated outfits, and we nearly collided at the corner. We both stopped, frozen in that awkward moment of recognition. She looked older than I remembered, more tired. Or maybe I was just seeing her clearly for the first time in years, without the filter of hope that she might someday be the mother I needed her to be. "Kelsey," she said, and her voice was carefully neutral. "I heard you were in town. Just for a few days. Working on the ranch." "I see." She shifted her shopping bags, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. "How long are you staying?" "I leave tomorrow morning. Back to Virginia Beach." We stood there in silence for a long moment, and I wondered if she was going to say anything about the lawsuit, about the article, about the 3 years of conflict that had defined our relationship since Dad died. But she didn't. She just looked at me with that same distant expression I'd seen my whole life, like she was looking at a stranger she was obligated to be polite to. Finally, I broke the silence. "Mom, why did you support Travis's lawsuit?" "Not the legal reasoning, the real reason." Why did you fight so hard to take away the one thing Dad specifically wanted me to have? She blinked, surprised by the directness. Then her face did something strange. It crumpled, just for a second, showing actual emotion before the mask went back up. Because he shouldn't have chosen you over Travis. Travis is the oldest. Travis stayed. Travis was here. Travis was here taking advantage. I was overseas serving my country. You chose that. You chose to leave. And there it was. The fundamental disconnect that had defined our relationship my entire life. She saw military service as abandonment, as choosing something over family, rather than as a valid and honorable path that required sacrifice. She couldn't separate physical presence from emotional connection. In her worldview, Travis was the better child simply because he'd stayed geographically close, regardless of the quality of his character or his relationship with Dad. I'm not going to change your mind, I said quietly. You're never going to see my service as anything other than me leaving. But Dad understood. Judge Martinez understood. And that's enough. Is it? Is it really enough, Kelsey? To have a judge's approval and your father's memory, but no relationship with your living family? I thought about that question seriously. Was it enough? Could I live with the permanent estrangement from my mother and brother, the knowledge that we'd never have normal family holidays or casual visits or any of the things that supposedly defined family relationships? Yes, I said finally. It's enough. Because what we had before wasn't really a family either. It was me performing for approval I was never going to get, funding celebrations I wasn't welcome at, trying to be someone I'm not to fit into a dynamic that was never going to accept me. This is better. Honest estrangement is better than dishonest connection. My mother's face hardened. That's a sad way to live. No, Mom. Sad was spending 34 years hoping you'd see me. This is liberation. I walked away without looking back. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding, but I felt clear. Certain. That conversation had been years overdue, and now it was done. No more hoping for change. No more wondering if someday they'd understand. Just acceptance of what was, and a clear-eyed decision to move forward without them. I spent my last evening at the ranch sitting in Dad's workshop. I'd started a project during the week, a small end table using some cherry wood I'd found stored in the back of the shop. It wasn't finished yet, but I'd made good progress, and working on it felt like connecting with Dad in a way that transcended his physical absence. His tools in my hands, his techniques guiding my cuts, his standards pushing me to do careful, quality work. As the sun set through the workshop windows, casting long shadows across the workbench, I thought about the journey from that courtroom in January to this moment in June. 6 months that had fundamentally reshaped my understanding of family, legacy, and what it meant to honor someone's memory. I'd fought a legal battle and won. I'd defended my reputation against false narratives and prevailed. I'd started building something new on the foundation Dad had left me. But more than any of that external victory, I'd gained something internal. The absolute certainty that I'd made the right choices, lived according to my values, and didn't need validation from people who were incapable of giving it. My father had seen me, had understood me, had trusted me with his legacy. That was enough. That was everything. I locked up the workshop as darkness fell, walked up to the main house, and stood on the porch looking out at land that was mine to protect and develop and eventually share with others who needed what it offered. Somewhere in Virginia, my mother was probably telling someone how unreasonable I'd been on that sidewalk. Somewhere in Asheville, Travis was probably still spreading his version of events to anyone who'd listen. But here, in the quiet of the mountains, none of that mattered. The ranch was mine. My father's legacy was secure. And I had 7 more years of military service ahead of me, 7 years to prepare for the life I'd build here after retirement. 7 years to save money, to plan programs, to develop the skills I'd need to run a veteran retreat that honored both my father's memory and the community I'd served with. Judge Martinez had ruled in my favor because the law was on my side and the evidence was clear. But the real victory wasn't legal. It was this moment, standing on this porch, feeling completely at peace with choices I'd made and the path ahead. They'd tried to take this from me through manipulation and legal action and social pressure. They'd failed. And I'd learned something crucial in the process. You don't need your family's approval to live a meaningful life. You just need to know your own worth and refuse to accept less than you deserve. 3 months after my confrontation with my mother on that Asheville sidewalk, I received an unexpected phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a Wednesday evening in September, and I was at the gym on base running through my regular workout routine when my phone buzzed in my locker. I almost didn't check it, but something made me look at the screen. The area code was local to Asheville. I stepped outside into the humid Virginia evening and called the number back. A woman's voice answered, older, with a slight tremor that suggested either age or nervousness. Is this Kelsey Brennan? Yes, who's calling? My name is Dorothy Hendricks. You don't know me, but I was your father's neighbor for 40 years. I lived in the property adjacent to your ranch until I moved into assisted living last year. I leaned against the wall of the gym, trying to place the name. Dad had mentioned neighbors occasionally in his letters, but I'd never spent enough time at the ranch as an adult to know many of them personally. What can I do for you, Mrs. Hendricks? I need to tell you something about your brother. About what he's been doing with your father's property. I've held my tongue because I didn't want to get involved in family business, but my conscience won't let me stay quiet anymore. My stomach tightened. What do you mean, what he's been doing with the property? There was a long pause, and I heard her take a shaky breath. Travis has been bringing people onto your land. Developers. He's been giving them tours, showing them the property lines, talking about clearing sections for cabin construction. I watched him do it 3 times over the summer before I moved out. He's been telling these people that the property is available for development, that he's in charge of the estate. I felt cold despite the warm evening air. The property isn't for sale. I own it outright. The court settled that in January. I know, dear. That's why I'm calling. Travis is either lying to these developers or he's planning something. But I thought you should know what's happening on your land when you're not there. After I hung up with Mrs. Hendricks, I immediately called the property management company. The manager, a competent woman named Lisa Chen, answered on the second ring. I asked her directly if she'd seen any unusual activity at the ranch, anyone visiting the property who shouldn't be there. Lisa hesitated, which told me everything I needed to know before she spoke. I've seen tire tracks on some of the back trails. Fresh ones that weren't there during my previous inspection. I assumed maybe you'd given someone permission to hunt or hike the property, so I didn't mention it. Should I have? No one has my permission to be on that land except you and your crew. If you see anyone there who isn't part of your team, I need you to call the sheriff immediately and then call me. Understood. I'll increase our inspection frequency and install some trail cameras on the main access points. If someone's trespassing, we'll get documentation. I spent the rest of that evening researching property laws in North Carolina, specifically around trespassing and fraudulent representation. What Travis was doing, if Mrs. Hendricks's account was accurate, wasn't just unethical. It was potentially illegal. He didn't own the property. He had no legal right to represent it to developers or give tours or discuss development plans. And if he was actively trying to negotiate deals or contracts on land he didn't own, that crossed into fraud territory. The next morning, I called Monica Garza, the attorney who'd represented me during the will contest. I explained what I'd learned, and she listened without interrupting until I finished. Then she said exactly what I'd hoped she'd say. We can stop this. If Travis is representing himself as having authority over property he doesn't own, we can pursue legal action. But first, we need documentation. The trail cameras are a good start. We also need to know exactly what he's telling these developers. How do we get that information? We set a trap. With your permission, I'll have one of my associates pose as a developer interested in mountain properties. We'll contact Travis through his real estate business, express interest in the Henderson County area, and see what he offers. If he brings up your property, if he claims he can facilitate a sale or development deal, we'll have him on record committing fraud. It felt manipulative, setting a trap for my own brother. But then I thought about what he was doing, actively trying to undermine my ownership, bringing strangers onto land that Dad had specifically entrusted to me, potentially setting up deals that could complicate my legal ownership even though he had no authority. Travis had made his choices. Now I was just documenting the consequences. Monica's associate, a man named David Park who actually had experience in real estate development, reached out to Travis's office the following week. He presented himself as an investor from Charlotte looking for mountain properties with development potential, specifically interested in the Henderson County area due to Asheville's growing tourism market. Travis took the meeting immediately, eager for what looked like a significant potential commission. David wore a wire to the meeting, legal in North Carolina with single-party consent. I listened to the recording later that week, and hearing Travis's voice made my hands clench into fists. He was smooth, professional, completely confident as he talked about various properties in the area. And then, exactly as we'd anticipated, he brought up the ranch. "Now, I have a unique opportunity that isn't officially on the market yet," Travis said, and I could hear the enthusiasm in his voice. 80 acres of prime mountain land, existing structures including a main house and outbuildings, incredible views. The owner is currently out of state and motivated to sell. We're looking at getting it listed within the next few months, but for the right buyer with the right offer, we could facilitate an early deal. "Who's the owner?" David asked, playing his role perfectly. "It's actually family property. My father's estate. My sister technically inherited it, but she's military, deployed constantly, no real attachment to the area. She's already agreed in principle to sell, we're just working out the details." That was a direct lie. I'd never agreed to anything, had never had a single conversation with Travis about selling. He was inventing a narrative to make himself look like he had authority he didn't possess. David continued. "What's the asking price?" "We're thinking $1.2 million for the full 80 acres. Could potentially subdivide if a buyer wanted to develop part and preserve part. The access is excellent, utilities already run to the main structures. It's a developer's dream, honestly." "And you're handling the sale personally?" "I will be, yes. Like I said, it's family property, so I have inside knowledge of the situation. My sister trusts me to handle the business side while she's focused on her military career." I stopped the recording there, too furious to listen to more. Travis wasn't just trespassing or giving unauthorized tours. He was actively trying to sell my property, lying to potential buyers about my intentions, fabricating a relationship of trust that had never existed. This was fraud, clear and documented. Monica filed a motion for an emergency restraining order the next day. She presented the recording, Mrs. Hendricks's testimony, the trail camera footage Lisa had collected showing Travis and other people walking my property, and a detailed argument that Travis was attempting to fraudulently represent ownership and negotiate sales of property he had no legal right to control. She requested an immediate order preventing Travis from accessing the ranch, from representing himself as having any authority over it, and from contacting any developers or potential buyers about it. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out, which meant I had to request emergency leave to fly back to North Carolina again. My commanding officer approved it immediately once I explained the situation. "Someone's trying to steal your property," he said bluntly. "Go handle it. We'll manage here." This time, I didn't wear my uniform to court. This wasn't about military service or respect for sacrifice. This was about property rights and fraud, and I dressed accordingly in a business suit that made me look like the property owner I was. Monica met me at the courthouse an hour before the hearing, and we reviewed our strategy one final time. Travis's attorney will argue that he was just trying to help, that he believed he was acting in your best interest by exploring market value, Monica explained. They'll claim he never intended to actually sell without your authorization, that he was just gathering information. Our job is to prove that his actions went beyond information gathering into active misrepresentation and fraud. Judge Catherine Reynolds handled the hearing, a woman in her late 50s with a reputation for being tough on property disputes. She'd reviewed our motion and Travis's response in advance, and when she called the court to order, her expression suggested she'd already formed some opinions about the case. Travis sat at the defendant's table with Richard Stokes, the same attorney who'd represented him during the will contest. He looked angry rather than worried, his jaw tight and his posture aggressive. He didn't look at me when I entered the courtroom, kept his eyes fixed forward like I didn't exist. Monica presented our evidence methodically. The recording of Travis's meeting with David, where he clearly stated he was handling the sale and that I'd agreed to sell. Mrs. Hendricks's testimony about the multiple developer tours. The trail camera footage showing Travis and others on the property without authorization. Financial records showing that Travis had never contributed to property taxes, insurance, or maintenance despite his claim of family involvement. Then Monica played her final card. She presented email correspondence between Travis and a development company based in Charlotte, emails where Travis had discussed preliminary plans for subdividing the property, where he'd shared survey maps and zoning information, where he'd negotiated a potential finder's fee for himself if a sale went through. These emails had been subpoenaed from the development company, who'd cooperated immediately once they realized they'd been dealing with someone who didn't actually own the property in question. Richard Stokes tried to minimize the damage during his presentation. He argued that Travis had been acting out of concern for the property's future, that he believed I wasn't capable of managing it from Virginia Beach, that he'd been trying to protect the family asset by exploring options. He pointed out that no actual sale had occurred, that no contracts had been signed, that everything Travis had done was preliminary and reversible. But Judge Reynolds wasn't buying it. She interrupted Richard's argument midway through. "Counselor, your client told a potential buyer that he was handling the sale of property he doesn't own. He brought multiple people onto that property without the owner's knowledge or permission. He negotiated fees for himself based on a transaction he had no authority to facilitate. This isn't concern for family assets. This is fraud." Richard tried to recover. "Your Honor, there was a misunderstanding about his authority. My client believed, based on family discussions, that he had implicit permission to explore options." "What family discussions?" Judge Reynolds looked directly at Travis. "Mr. Brennan, did you have any conversation with your sister about selling this property?" Travis shifted in his seat. "Not directly, but, yes or no, Mr. Brennan." "Did you speak with Kelsey Brennan about selling the ranch?" "No, but I assumed she'd want to sell eventually, given that she doesn't live here." "You assumed. So you took it upon yourself to represent property you don't own, based on assumptions, without bothering to contact the actual owner." Judge Reynolds's voice was sharp. "That's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Brennan. That's fraud." She granted the restraining order immediately. Travis was prohibited from accessing the ranch property under any circumstances. He was prohibited from representing himself as having any authority over the property. He was required to contact every developer or potential buyer he'd spoken with and clarify that he had no ownership or authority. And he was ordered to pay my legal fees for having to file this motion. But Judge Reynolds went further than we'd requested. She also ordered Travis to undergo a mental health evaluation to determine if his behavior indicated a pattern of delusional thinking about property rights. "I'm concerned," she said, looking at Travis with something like pity, "that you genuinely believe you have rights to property that was legally awarded to your sister. That level of disconnect from reality suggests you need professional assessment." Travis exploded. He stood up, ignoring Richard's attempt to pull him back down. "This is insane. That property should be mine. I'm the son. I stayed here. I took care of Dad. She's the one who abandoned him, who only showed up when it was convenient, and somehow she gets everything." "Mr. Brennan, sit down," Judge Reynolds said firmly. "No. This whole system is rigged. She shows up in her fancy uniform and everyone treats her like a hero, but what about the people who actually stay and do the hard work of being present? What about the people who don't run away to play soldier?" The courtroom went absolutely silent. Even Richard Stokes looked horrified at what Travis had just said. Judge Reynolds's face hardened into an expression of pure disgust. "Mr. Brennan, you just demonstrated exactly why you don't deserve that property. Your sister didn't play soldier. She served her country in one of the most elite military units in the world. And your father understood the difference between geographical presence and actual character, which is why he left her the ranch. Now sit down before I hold you in contempt." Travis sat down, but the damage was done. He'd shown the court exactly who he was, someone so consumed by entitlement that he couldn't even pretend to respect his sister's service or his father's wishes. Judge Reynolds added another provision to the restraining order on the spot. Travis was required to complete an anger management program in addition to the mental health evaluation. After the hearing, Monica and I stood outside the courthouse while Travis and Richard Stokes left through a different exit. I felt drained, not triumphant. Watching my brother's public breakdown hadn't been satisfying. It had just been sad, a confirmation that we'd never be able to repair whatever relationship we'd once had. He's going to appeal, Monica said matter-of-factly. The restraining order, possibly the mental health requirement. Be prepared for this to continue. How long? Months, maybe longer. But Kelsey, you need to understand something. This isn't really about the property anymore. Your brother has built his entire identity around being the deserving child who got cheated. Letting go of that narrative would mean accepting that your father chose you for legitimate reasons, that he wasn't confused or manipulated, that Travis simply wasn't the child your father trusted with his legacy. That's a hard truth to accept. I thought about that conversation with my mother on the sidewalk, how she'd said it was sad to live without family connections. But what was sadder was Travis's inability to move forward, his obsession with taking something that was never meant to be his complete lack of understanding about why Dad had made the choice he'd made. That evening, I had dinner with Vanessa at a restaurant downtown. She'd been at the hearing, sitting in the back row, and she'd heard everything Travis said. Play soldier, she repeated, shaking her head. Like 12 years as a SEAL is some kind of hobby you picked up for fun. He genuinely doesn't understand, I said. And he never will. To him, military service is just an excuse I used to avoid family obligations. The idea that it might be valuable in itself, that it might be something worth dedicating your life to, that doesn't compute for him. Are you going to be okay with how permanent this is? The restraining order, the estrangement, all of it? I thought about that question seriously. Was I okay with it? My brother couldn't come to the ranch. My mother wasn't speaking to me. My entire biological family had effectively disowned me over my refusal to let them control property that wasn't theirs. Most people would see that as a tragedy, a failure of family relationships. But I didn't feel tragic. I felt free. Free from the constant weight of trying to earn approval from people who were never going to give it. Free from the obligation to fund their celebrations and accept their dismissal. Free from the hope that someday they'd see me the way Dad had seen me. I'm more than okay with it, I told Vanessa. This is what closure looks like. Not reconciliation or forgiveness or some heartwarming moment where everyone finally understands each other. Just a clear ending. They go their way, I go mine, and we stop pretending there's a relationship worth preserving. 3 days later, I returned to Virginia Beach, and life resumed its normal rhythm. Training exercises. Physical conditioning. Administrative work. The daily routine of military life that had defined my adult existence. But something had shifted in how I approached that routine. I wasn't just killing time until retirement anymore. I was actively preparing for what came next. I started taking courses online through a veterans organization about program development and nonprofit management. If I was serious about turning the ranch into a retreat for veterans, I needed to understand the administrative and legal side of running that kind of operation. I researched grants available for veteran services, studied successful retreat models, and began networking with other veterans who'd created similar programs in other states. I also started building the financial foundation more aggressively. I increased my savings rate to 40% of my income, knowing that every dollar I put away now would translate into improvements on the ranch later. I created detailed budgets for the renovation projects I'd need to complete, the insurance costs I'd need to cover, the operating expenses of running a retreat program. The numbers were daunting, but they were achievable if I stayed focused and disciplined. 6 months after the restraining order hearing, I received a letter from an attorney I didn't know. It was addressed to me at the base, and when I opened it, I found a legal notice that Travis had filed for bankruptcy. Apparently, his real estate business had been failing for months, and the legal fees from both the will contest and the restraining order case had pushed him over the edge financially. He was liquidating his assets, closing his office, and starting over. The letter explained that I was listed as a creditor because Travis claimed I owed him money for property management services he'd allegedly provided at the ranch over the years. It was a last desperate attempt to get something from me, to claim that his unauthorized presence on my property had actually been helpful and deserved compensation. I forwarded the letter to Monica, who responded with a formal declaration that no such services had been requested or authorized, and that his claim was frivolous. The bankruptcy trustee dismissed it immediately. But learning about Travis's financial collapse brought a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me felt like it was justice, the natural consequence of his choices catching up with him. He'd spent years living beyond his means, trying to project success he hadn't actually achieved, counting on the ranch sale to solve his financial problems. When that solution evaporated, when I refused to enable his plans, everything else collapsed. Another part of me felt something almost like pity. Travis was my brother, even if we hadn't been close in decades. We'd grown up in the same house, been raised by the same father, had the same opportunities to learn Dad's values and apply them to our lives. But somewhere along the way, Travis had chosen entitlement over effort, appearance over substance, and now he was paying the price. I called Vanessa to process these feelings, and she listened patiently while I worked through the emotional complexity. "You're allowed to feel multiple things," she said finally. "You can recognize that Travis brought this on himself while also feeling sad that your brother's life is falling apart. Those things aren't contradictory. I keep thinking about what Dad would say if he could see all this. The lawsuits, the restraining order, Travis going bankrupt. Would he be disappointed? Would he regret leaving me the ranch if he'd known it would cause this much family destruction?" Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "Kels, your dad knew exactly what he was doing. He knew Travis wouldn't accept being passed over. He knew your mom would side with Travis. He knew there'd be conflict. And he did it anyway, because he believed the ranch was worth protecting even at the cost of family peace. Don't second-guess his decision just because it turned out to be as hard as he probably expected it would be." She was right. Dad had made his choice with full knowledge of the consequences. He'd chosen to protect the land, to ensure it went to someone who'd honor its meaning rather than exploit its value. The fact that choice led to conflict wasn't a failure of his judgment. It was confirmation that he'd understood his children well enough to know what would happen and had decided it was worth it. Winter came, and with it my annual performance review. My commanding officer noted that my focus had been split over the past year, that I'd taken more leave than usual, that my attention had sometimes been on civilian matters rather than fully on my duties. But he also noted that my actual performance had never suffered, that I'd maintained my physical standards and completed every assigned task to the high level expected of SEALs. "You've got 7 years left until retirement eligibility," he said during our final review meeting. "Are you planning to stay the full 20? I'd been asking myself that same question for months. Originally, I'd planned to serve the full 20 years, to maximize my pension and benefits before transitioning to civilian life. But the ranch was changing that calculation. Every month I stayed in active duty was another month the property sat mostly empty, another month the workshop stayed unused, another month I delayed starting the veteran retreat program I'd been planning. "I'm not sure anymore," I admitted. "The retirement benefits at 20 years are significant, but I'm starting to think the opportunity cost might be higher than the financial benefit." He nodded slowly. "If you're considering early retirement, start the paperwork now. The process takes months, and you want to give yourself time to change your mind if you decide to stay." That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following months. What if I didn't wait 7 more years? What if I put in my retirement paperwork now, transitioned out in a year, and started building the retreat at 35 instead of 42? I'd lose some pension benefits, but I'd gain 7 years of actually doing the work I felt called to do. 7 years of veterans using the workshop, hiking the trails, finding healing through the same kind of hands-on work that had saved me more times than I could count. I submitted my retirement paperwork in the spring, requesting separation after 14 years of service instead of the full 20. The decision felt simultaneously terrifying and absolutely right. I'd be walking away from 6 years of additional pension benefits, from the security of military structure, from an identity I'd built my entire adult life around. But I'd be walking towards something that mattered more, something that honored my father's legacy while serving the community I'd been part of for over a decade. The ranch transformation began the month after I signed my terminal leave papers. I had 6 months before my official separation date, and I used every moment of leave I could accrue to work on the property. The stable became a workshop space with stations for woodworking, metalwork, and leathercraft. I installed proper ventilation, updated the electrical system, and filled the space with tools donated by organizations supporting veteran programs. The guest cabin got a complete renovation, new insulation and windows, a small kitchen area, bunks that could sleep 6 people comfortably. Vanessa moved into the main house with me 3 months before my retirement became official. Her gym in Asheville had been successful, but when I told her about my plans for the retreat, she'd offered to partner with me immediately. She'd handle the fitness and outdoor programming while I focused on the workshop trades and property management. We'd split ownership of the nonprofit we established, Brennan Veterans Retreat, named after my father. Our first official retreat weekend happened 2 weeks after my retirement ceremony. 6 veterans, all dealing with various stages of post-service transition, arrived on a Friday afternoon in October. We didn't have an elaborate program or schedule. Just an invitation to work with their hands, to be outside, to remember what it felt like to build something tangible. By Sunday evening, we'd repaired half a mile of fence line, built 2 picnic tables for the property, and started a bookshelf one of the guys wanted to finish at home. Nobody talked much about their service or their struggles. That wasn't the point. The healing happened in the rhythm of work, in the satisfaction of sanding a piece of wood smooth, in the shared silence of people who understood what it meant to serve and to come home changed. On Sunday night, sitting around a fire pit we'd built that afternoon, one of the veterans said something that made everything worth it. "I haven't felt this calm in 3 years. Not since I got back from my last deployment. I forgot what it felt like to just exist without constantly being on alert." That was exactly what my father had given me in this place. That sense of peace that came from connecting with the land, from working with your hands, from being present in a moment without the weight of past trauma or future anxiety. Now I was able to offer it to others, to create a space where veterans could find the same healing I'd found. The first year of the retreat was rough financially. We ran on donations, small grants, and my retirement savings. Vanessa and I both took part-time jobs in town to cover personal expenses while we built the program. We hosted 2 retreats a month, gradually increasing to weekly sessions as word spread through veteran networks. Some participants came once. Others returned every few months, treating the ranch as a touch point they needed to maintain their equilibrium. Travis's bankruptcy finalized during that first year. I heard through Vanessa's connections that he'd moved to South Carolina, taken a job working for someone else's real estate firm, started over in a place where nobody knew his history. My mother sold the house in town and moved to a retirement community in Florida. Neither of them reached out, and I didn't pursue contact. The estrangement was complete, and I'd made peace with it. Judge Martinez, who'd ruled in my favor during that initial will contest, visited the ranch during our 2nd year of operation. He'd heard about the retreat program through a veterans organization he supported, and he wanted to see what we'd built. Walking him through the workshop, showing him the projects veterans had completed, watching his face as he recognized the value of what we were doing, felt like closing a circle that had begun in his courtroom. "Your father would be proud," he said, standing on the porch of the main house, looking out at the valley. "Not just because you protected the land, but because you're using it exactly the way he hoped someone would. As a place of healing and purpose." 5 years after my retirement, the Brennan Veterans Retreat had served over 400 veterans. We'd expanded our programming to include week-long intensives, specialized courses in specific trades, and partnerships with mental health professionals who understood military culture. The ranch sustained itself through a combination of grants, donations, and a growing network of supporters who believed in what we were doing. I never heard from my mother or Travis again. The silence became permanent, and I accepted it as the natural conclusion to relationships that had never been authentic. But I built a different kind of family, veterans who returned year after year, staff members who believed in our mission, community members who donated time and resources to support our work. These were people who showed up not because they were obligated by blood, but because they chose to be part of something meaningful. On what would have been my father's 75th birthday, I stood in his workshop with a group of veterans learning the basics of furniture construction. The space was full of the sounds he'd loved, the rasp of saws, the tap of hammers, the quiet concentration of people focused on creating something with their hands. And I knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly what he'd envisioned when he'd left me the ranch. Not just preserved land, but living purpose. Not just protected property, but transformative space. The uniform that had defined me for 14 years hung in my closet now, a reminder of who I'd been and what I'd proven. But my identity wasn't wrapped up in that uniform anymore. It was here, in the work I did every day, in the lives touched by what we'd built, in the legacy my father had entrusted to me and that I'd honored in the best way I knew how. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.